Hi, I'm Bella Gassemi-Smith, head of the Aurora Tech Award, and this is Woman in the Building, a podcast for female founders building in emerging markets. This podcast is the space to meet women like you who are building, breaking, and figuring it out as they go. Each episode, 3 guests join our roundtable to share real stories and hard-earned lessons, so that founderhood feels a little less like a solo journey. So I'd like to introduce our first guest, who brings the data behind what we're talking about.
Hi guys, nice to meet you all. My name is Hangyul, currently calling from Busan, South Korea, which is where I'm from.
Hangyul Lee-Song is a data intelligence lead at Briter, a business intelligence platform for emerging markets. And Hangyul has the latest data points from Briter's reports that will help us unpack the issue.
2 of our most recent reports have been around women tech entrepreneurs in Africa. And we also looked at more of a qualitative study on understanding where our ag tech women founders experience with their fundraising and also running companies. So just based on those experiences and some of our other more also qualitative stories, which I think oftentimes get quite low in priority when it comes to people thinking about the analysis, I'm hoping that I can bring some of those things to the table.
The second guest of this roundtable is Elena Lipilina. She's the co-founder of Visible Sports, an online platform that helps sports enthusiasts and grassroots clubs and teams find each other. But Elena's experience does not stop there.
I've actually worked for the International Finance Corporation, which is a part of the World Bank Group. And I worked as a consultant for the program called ScaleX. So ScaleX was designed to actually close the gender gap in financing of women-led startups. We were working with investors and LPs to help close that gap. So, I've seen the other side of the story, and I've seen where probably the problem lies, but I've also learned a lot.
And if you're not yet impressed by Elena, on top of that, she's also a fellow podcaster. She hosts a show called FemTech Money Talks, which is all about fundraising in FemTech. So Elena brings both hands-on and collective founder experience to today's discussion. And finally, we have Eugenia Dunaeva, who is, an exceptional investor.
Thanks for the intro, Bella. With investing, you have to wait a little bit, like some 10 years, some 12 years, 15 years to actually see how great you are.
Eugenia started as an angel investor while leading commercial teams in big tech. First at Expedia, then at Meta, before moving into venture capital. Now, Eugenia is a partner at DVC, a San Francisco-based VC firm that invested in, for instance, Perplexity.
So now I'm LP at several funds. I'm also what's called an operating partner. So someone that supports portfolio companies on my subject matter expertise, which is GTM and sales. My expertise in my portfolio spans across US and Europe. So I'm not as involved in emerging markets. I'm super excited to learn more on this during today's podcast. And my investment thesis, if you so want, it's largely B2B. So I invest in companies that I understand. And also I dedicate around 20% of my investments to the companies that help me learn actually about the industries that I'm not familiar with.
That's how Eugenia earned recognition as one of the top 30 female investors to watch in climate globally. I mean, what a guest list, right? So we brought these 3 women together, and I really wanted this episode to be a constructive conversation backed up by the data. And I think we managed to keep it in that direction. But of course, there will be some personal anecdotes along the way, both funny, sad, and relatable. Because isn't that the truth about fundraising as a woman in the world of venture? I'm going to start with kind of the simplest bit, which is looking at the status quo of what exists today in the world of venture capital. And so, Hangyul, I was actually wondering if you had to kind of summarize the situation that exists from your angle in terms of when we look at female founders raising investment, what would be your kind of summary of the situation that you're seeing?
First, when I talk about gender and the founders, I'll use the words women-led company, meaning that these are all women teams. And then we also have a distinguished mixed gender team from woman-led team. And then third is men-only companies. And these are where C-suite or the founding team, as we can see, are more men. So that's just setting the scene as the words that I'll be using. And then the other is just big thing to say is we have done this study on sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of the trend that we see in women generally follow the bigger trend of the sub-Saharan Africa. There are concentration of funding in few sectors, and those are fintech, e-commerce, part of the world, agri-food tech, logistics. There's a huge concentration of those. And then some other ones where women get a little bit more interested in is actually in FemTech and then EdTech. Where it gets interesting is that in general, when it comes to the quantity of funding, women do raise where men raise a lot. When we actually compare it to how much men raise, they're overly presented in FinTech, EdTech, Health Tech, and FemTech. But then they're underrepresented in some of the largest raising sectors like fintech and e-commerce. And then the other part where it differs a bit is that about 25% of funding altogether that goes into startups in sub-Saharan Africa are on companies that are raised or that are led by women. And then when we look one layer deeper, these three hubs are rising: Kenya and East Africa, Nigeria on West, and then South Africa in the Southern and Central. When we take those out, actually the proportion of women funding becomes less than 5%.
Can I jump real quick? Because I have...
Jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to, the stats that we had at the IFC, in our program was that there is 2 times more revenue collected from women-led startups. And that's kind of, the stat that we were proud of. And also there's another kind of stat which is 41% higher average return on equity on women-led startups. Has this been something that you've been able to observe? Like, I was flaunting that, but I would be very happy to kind of back it up with more than one source.
Yeah, we have not been able to capture that exact return rate. We really go through the data at the first part of the flow. However, what we are actually witnessing is those that end up raising, at least at that equity, the Series A level, they're less likely to actually go out of business than men-led companies.
Sustainability, yeah?
Sustainability of companies, the way that they're running seems to be much at a steady rate. Then the growth rate in some ways can differ, partially because depending on the sectors that they're going into are not as, I think, high return as some of the men-led sectors like fintech or e-commerce, right? So I think there is some element to that. But the other part is they tend to, even if they don't scale at an exponential level, what they're quite good at is actually reaching that revenue-driven company quicker than men do. Also, they don't raise as big, so they're not also as stressed to scale as large. So that probably also plays a role there.
Yes, that's for sure. That's an observation that I can confirm from the investor perspective. I think women-led startups or female founders, they tend to be way more pragmatic in terms of valuations and numbers. Part of it is obviously also a challenge for them to fundraise as much as men can. But at the same time, it's serving them positively because then they are under less pressure from VCs moving forward. The statistics that you shared, Hangyul, is super interesting. I wonder what those 3 hubs are doing differently from Africa overall, because, it sounds like the overall numbers, excluding them, seems to be in line with what we see globally. This very famous 3% of VC funding going to female founders. Yet these hubs are outperforming significantly. I think the world has something to learn from them.
I was just double checking some of the information while we're talking. So if we actually only take out those that are only women, only team, that number goes down half-folds. So basically out of the 25, about 15% of those are mixed gender groups. But when we go down to that, it's much smaller. And even the size of the funding is less than 5%. Where women tend to actually do quite well in terms of the deal stages, again, is at a very, very early stage. Incubators and accelerators, and I think this is why some of the hubs are actually doing well, is that there is some sort of pipeline driving entities, whether that's an incubator and accelerator, that's actually creating and actually making efforts of making more women inclusive acceleration and incubator program. Now, there is a huge drop off after the incubator and accelerator stage for many women founders. At that post acceleration stage, so at pre-seed and the seed, the gap is actually the highest between women and men. Kenya, I think, is really overperforming many other of the hubs in terms of closing that gap between incubator accelerator rate and then dropping off at the seed and Series A rate. I think part of it is there are a good angel investor network currently in Kenya. There are angel network groups that are doing a little bit more woman-driven companies. And not to mention, this is probably the biggest hub when it comes to international donor money, international development money coming in. So there are a lot of also LPs that are putting money into the funds that have woman or gender lens embedded in it.
If we were to look at the summary of it, basically what you're telling me is there's good pipeline at the beginning, maybe not as many as men, but there's good pipeline. Then there's immense drop-off, but the immense drop-off is not paralleled by bad performance. It's actually paralleled by better performance. And so you are going to then ask the question of why.
I think this is where you cannot help but to bring in some of the qualitative insights as to why this is the case. There are a few things that they mention as to why they feel they cannot really get through that door when it comes to pre-seed and seed funding. And I don't know if this also is a global north phenomenon, and we'll be quite curious, Eugenia, from how you have been experiencing this. But everyone has been telling me that, deals happen behind closed doors. It happens at that 1 a.m. discussion at a bar. Many women who also tend to be, I think, have a slightly more responsibilities at a household level or at child rearing and bearing reasons. And again, this is a generalized statement, but from what I can gather, it still is the case. This is not a place they want to hang out. Not to mention, it can be quite hostile. And then two, some of the products, when it comes to FemTech, I think a lot of investors that are not women-driven don't oftentimes understand the market. And then also three, when we compare women founders and men founders who are working in similar sectors, we do see that proportionally men tend to go less through the grant route. And then when we then do speak with women who have used grant round but have a hard time raising, they say when we go to pitch to the investors, they see that we've been mainly funded by grants, partially because that's the only thing that we're getting. They think of us as like an impact or socially impactful company and hence not as fit for investment purposes. And this does not seem to be as big of an issue for a lot of men founders who do also use grants as part of their funding strategy, partially because I think the way that they storytell might be a bit different than how women founders tell. Even if it were to make sense, we've been hearing a lot from our women founders that they would actually pitch a similar idea as men founders. And then they've been heard that, oh, you don't actually belong in the fintech realm. I think you should go into ed tech realm. Even the way that they pitch, even if it's a similar product, I think they get actually put into a different category. And I think this is where actually the bias actually plays in a little bit higher than, frankly, other judgment calls around the business model in itself, right? So there are a lot of qualitative stories that I'm hearing as to why this drop-off is so significant.
I mean, grants, it's an important topic, and we discussed that a lot with FemTech, for example, because FemTech is vastly underfunded, and grants sometimes is the only way for the FemTech, especially when it's the hardware, is the only way to lift off the ground, to get at least some patents, to get some validation in the clinical setting. I just wanted to second what you were saying, because I have a particular story about the gender bias that are happening, like who pitches matters. So we were working on the Latin America showcase, okay? So under the terms of the showcase, we were selecting 150 startups, women-led startups, and that's an important point. So out of 150 women-led startups, we were to select 10 who would go to Bogota to present in front of at the kind of web summit in Bogota, okay? And there was a cash prize involved as well. So the thing is, we employed a partner who are very well known, and they're super supportive and empowering women all across the world. They're reputable partner we've had for a long time, okay? So their task was to pre-select the startups for the showcase, okay? So that's, the scene is set. I was not there because most of the interviews were held in Spanish. So they provided us with the outcome of these interviews. And again, the criteria was it's a women-led startup. Women did not necessarily have to pitch, right? So I'm looking at this metric of 150 startups, then narrowed down to 50, then narrowed down to 10. What do you think I'm seeing?
Mostly men.
Male co-founders pitching.
Kind of. You're very close. I started looking at the scores initially because I saw a lot of discrepancies in the figures, and the figures talk. And some of the marks are like wide off. Okay, so the business idea of startup X is like way down from the startup Y. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting because like, the 150 we had to narrow down from 1,000. So they're like, it shouldn't be that much of a difference, right? So like I'm looking at this and then I start checking who was pitching. So it turns out in the startups where women were pitching, the business model, the financial viability, all the hardcore metrics that are important for the investors were in average 1.5 times lower than the ones that were pitched by men. I ran the math like several times because I didn't want to point fingers because it, kind of looks bad, right? And only then I was like, but who was in the panel? Who was judging? And guess who was judging? So the man who was the representative of that company was the one who's doing that. And his bias got in the way so badly. And I don't think it was his intention. Another case that I had about pitching it per se was when I talked to the angel investor. So what she said was, it's often not what women are saying, it's how they're saying that and the confidence with which they're pitching things. Right. So, and that's the difference. That's the core difference. And that's because it's human and it's a human decision. It doesn't have to do anything with the math, but it has everything to do with the way we carry ourselves in the world. And I think it's it's crucial to pay attention to that in a sense. And I'm sorry, I hope I'm not driving this conversation away from, from where we wanted to go, but I just really wanted to make these two examples.
No, obviously I'm conscious of the context that I gave at the beginning, but at the same time, you also don't want to hide the kind of truth. And that's why I wanted Hangyul to start, because this conversation couldn't start on only personal anecdotes. It had to start on data. And I think the data kind of speaks for itself. I think maybe to give an explanation on our side of things at Aurora, everything you said I can echo. I think bias isn't malicious necessarily. I know a lot of men specifically that I respect in business that are just inherently biased towards not thinking female founders are great. I think at one of our pitches, one of them said, I was like, who would you take a bet on? Not even this business, but them as a founder. Who would you take a bet on? And he said, none of them. Back to your point, Hangyul, every single one of these founders was revenue and profit making by this point because they hadn't received investment. So they really had to have a proposition people were willing to pay for. And so they could sustain themselves. And I'm like, well, if they hustled enough to get to this point, are you sure? But they're not exciting enough, because they're realistic. And then that brings me back to the question about venture capital generally. And I'm really sorry to say this, Eugenia, but the model is not performing that well. It's obviously a high growth asset class, but general returns in VC and the amount of funds that are closing would suggest to me that the predictability of the outcomes, the power law does not justify everything. I do think a lot of investors are making decisions on things that they don't understand, whether it's femtech or whether it's fintech. And a lot of it is based on their sentiment towards either the investor that has given them the deal or how they feel about the founder. But what do we do?
Yeah, I think when we speak about the problems in the VC world, we often kind of overlook the fact that VC world is a small representation of the world overall. Right. And the world overall is where the gender pay gap exists. You need to get promoted as a woman, you jump through hoops, whereas men just get promoted because they have potential and so on and so forth. And all of those things are present, unfortunately, in the VC world as well. And when we think of female funding or funding for female-led startups, we also, have to think of who decides where the funding goes. And the numbers in terms of general partners or partners in the funds as well, they are better than 3% of the funding going to female founders, but it's still, I think, between 15 to 17 or 18% globally, depending on the country. What it means in reality is mostly that I would probably be the only woman in the room at a VC meeting. And the root cause of it is also, there are plenty of things that we can discuss. It's the access to capital that women have in general. as, GPs, because if you think of general partners who run the funds, their two jobs are A, to fundraise from LPs, and B, then to deploy the funds, to allocate the funds to invest in startups. So GPs are themselves in the position of raising the funds, and who they're raising the funds from. Institutional or high net worth individuals, those would still be mostly males, right? And then those LPs would be ultimately in a more direct or more indirect form or shape impacting the investment decisions that those GPs make, right? If we exclude the funds that are purely focused on some niche industries, like we call FemTech a niche industry, or will be focusing on female founders and so on. So there are funds that are kind of putting it into their thesis. But overall, in general funds, the focus would still be how happy the LPs are with allocation of the capital and with the exits. And then this is, as you said, the question of biases and the affirmative bias of like, I invest into the founders that look like me, speak like me, feel like me, went to the same college, or you name it. So the more men we have in VC, the more men will be funded ultimately. I think one of the solutions to your point, right? I'm also not too happy complaining about it. I think a lot of it is about supporting women to actually learn about this industry, go into this industry, break into VC and start investing. But B is actually for the men to step up, for the men to realize like how many biases they have. Ultimately, what I think can be done is before any of them judges any competition, like in, Elena's example, like I get invited to competitions plenty of times to judge the pitches. None of the organizers reminds us about, hey guys, there are like 3 biases that we see persisting in this industry. This is one of them. This is the second one. This is the third one. To be conscious of them while you are judging. And I think it's just so important to proactively impose or like proactively promote this understanding of, you are in this industry where you're deciding sometimes people's lives, futures, destinies, and so on. So that's part of the things that I think that could be done.
And Elena, I actually wanted to draw back to you and the work with ScaleX, because you literally tried to tackle this exact problem. Are there any learnings you can kind of take from there and perhaps share here?
I mean, definitely, because we worked in Latin America and worked in Africa as well. And I think if there is a conscious effort to invest in women, I mean, it sometimes starts with a woman in design, like in the management design, okay? We start with accelerators and then we go on to the VC setup, okay? So if the woman is a driving force and is able to create the system of an acceleration that focuses on women, or at least has 50% of women-led startups, that's a winning formula for everyone. Again, building on what Hangyul said, there is a rapid decline in what's happening after. So if one of the jobs that accelerators have, and they don't normally do, is following up on their alumni. Basically, sometimes what the accelerators do is hey, here's some money in a good case, or here's some perks, in the form of money, non-monetary. But, then there's a demo day, but we don't care what happens to you after that. Okay. And accelerators that we worked with, they actually followed up. And that resulted in their deal flow for the startups, the accelerators, that I think it drew threefold. Okay. So that gap that Hangyul was talking about was closing slowly, only because first, the accelerator made a concerted effort to have more women, and then made an effort to push women-led startups through that pipeline, to help them secure the pilots, to help them secure the first investors or the angel investors, not just doing like, hey, demo day, bye-bye. And another good example is the one I experienced myself was with Startup Chile. Startup Chile is one of the biggest startup accelerators. It's considered to be the Y Combinator of Latin America. Before that, I've pitched to a large number of, accelerators, panels, whatnot. But this one was different, because there were two women in the room, but they didn't feel like curveballs. You see what I mean? Like they didn't feel like, oh, I'm here to get you, like I'm here to find your weakness to get you out kind of thing. And that's something I personally felt as a founder all the time. Like they throw the curveballs, you have to be ready to hit it back. That felt more like a constructive conversation, exploring what might be the weakness for me. And I'm fine with that. And initiatives like Aurora Tech Awards play an incredible role in this process. Met a lot of the key people in Aurora, and talking to them, you don't feel like you're pitching. You feel like you are in a room with the most empowering and inspiring women, and you're just exchanging ideas. And I think that's what we should aim for.
Angel investors actually play a big role in funding women. And this is actually where the lack of data actually becomes also an issue, is that funding by angel investors, especially in emerging market setting, it does become very difficult to track.
The observation, I guess, from my side would be that whenever a male founder sees an opportunity to launch something, and we know that now with AI, like launching something is really, really quick, they would just do it. Whereas female founders tend to think a lot more about their project and sometimes overthink. There's always this, lack of confidence. They think that they are not qualified enough to build something in this space. If the industry is not theirs, they would probably try to find a co-founder that would possess the knowledge and the network in the space. That is not necessarily the case for male founders. And that's probably the case, to Hangyul's point. There are female angel investors who see this doubt in the female founders, and they realize that this doubt, it's actually just a built-in feature, and it's probably why they invest more in female founders at early stage. But there is this very known notion, right, that it's also quite tricky and even dangerous for female founders only raise from female investors at an early stage, because that can backfire at the later stages for you. Sometimes to people, it doesn't really, unfortunately, show that you are competent and your business model is great and your PMF is amazing. It can signal that, there is this sisterhood and female support and whatever, you name it. So this one advice for female founders is to try to build this mixed pool of investors that support you early on.
That is a specific point of the caught in a rock and a hard place, because I think what we see on our side is a lot of our companies, despite having good recurring revenue annually, despite having actually niche but good product market fit, not being VC backable. And so, so there's that. There's the VC route, and that's closed. So then your next route is, okay, well, we'll just grow sustainably and do it revenue based, which I'm kind of leaning towards that is the best tool we can give women, is build sustainable businesses rather than waiting for someone to validate your business. I think some of the things we tell our founders now is look, we will do our absolute best to leverage the network that we have, as InDrive, and through my own network and through the network of our team, because we can get into places that maybe you can't, literally due to structural bias. But if they say no, it's their loss. You should go and build anyway. And does it matter if you're not going to build as quickly or at the growth rate? What does it mean to be venture backable? Because this is the thing. I think a lot of the conversations we have these days is around, well, how do you bridge the gender funding gap? And how do you get more people into investing that are not men? But like you just said, then you have something like Aurora by 4 female founders. And every time I ask a female founder, for example, let's say she's a FinTech founder, and I say, would you like to win FinTech Founder of the Year award? Or would you like to win Female Founder of the Year award? They always say FinTech Founder of the Year award. So it's even in the things that building funnels for female founders, whether it's an accelerator, whether it's an award, it's not taken seriously, like you just said, Eugenia, if you're only backed by female angel investors, because you're backed by the woman. So you're at a subcategory. So it ends up hitting you in the back, which is crazy to me, right? And so I have like spent many a day thinking about this and thinking about, should women behave more like men and change their mindset and get out of their own way and like, be the dude and bring the confidence and, sit on that chair but be a little bit uncomfortable? Or should you, screw the system and like only raise from women and wait for more female founders to be in positions of having capital and, or should you just build? And so this comes to the overall question, which is like, is the best resource to give people. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, go on, Eugenia.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly about the whole VC world. It's such a very peculiar world. The rules of the game are that the higher the multiples are in the industry that you are building, the more interesting and attractive you are to the overall VC world, right? So this is also something, for female founders to think about. If they really, really, really want to go hardcore VC, maybe you need to be focusing on, as we said, like fintech, perhaps e-commerce, AI, B2B SaaS, try to raise sort of your chances of winning in this. Yeah, go ahead, Elena. Sorry.
No, I actually kind of looking for the alternatives to the VC backing, and it's actually growing a business. And as hard as this might sound, this is something, again, like one of the FemTech founders told me. She's like, I'm not going to take VC funding because I'm going to take out a loan from the bank because the bank does not take my equity. And this equity is not diluted. And that means no board made up of men is running my FemTech company in the end, ousting me potentially as a CEO. And I thought it was such a smart thing to say. But again, you have to look at the model. Her model was highly, and still is, very replicable and very scalable. And, she could allow herself to do that. We are witnessing a shift in the way that VCs are perceived and the way that VCs operate. A VC can be hostile, even though they're bringing money on the table. To some extent, I agree with you that go to fintech if you want to score with the VCs. Don't go to femtech if you want to score to VCs. But if we come to think about why, I'm circling back to Hangyul here because she said sometimes these startups are seen as impact. What's so bad about impact? That's what I heard a lot myself, because my startup was and is about health tech and sports tech in particular that had to do with access to, physical activity for people. And of course, it had a business model behind it. But the thing is impact. And I'm like, as well.
I actually wanted to circle back to Hangyul. Obviously, we started with you and you laid a beautiful, couldn't have said it better myself, foundation on the kind of status quo that we have today. And then we've obviously gone into the more anecdotal pattern recognition. But circling back to you, do you have any thoughts on kind of the things that we touched upon so far?
There are a few different points I wanted to bring up, which is I really do like this, where this is going around, looking at funding and fundraising really as, in many ways, working capital strategy, right? VC funding just happens to be an asset class that takes huge risks for these very early stage companies. But if that asset class is something that seems hostile or does not seem to be working for women, I think it's one thing to actually start looking at, okay, what else is out there? I think, Elena, your point or example of someone who is able to get to the bank, I think in emerging market, I think can be a bit of an anomaly sometimes because debt class, unfortunately, also is as equally, if not more, I think hostile to many women, especially if you are working very specifically at that early stage. I think banks in general are very unwilling to take bets on these early stage companies. So if we're talking about what can we do, what do we mobilize, I think it's also time to look at the other side of the funding away from equity models and see, okay, well, what are some of the other sources of working capital that most MSCs tap into or MSMEs tap into?
So if you're not familiar with an MSE, that's referring to mid-sized enterprises, and an MSME is micro, small, and medium enterprises.
And those are debts, and many times debts. So if we are talking about companies that are healthy in revenue, I wonder if that incubator and accelerator help should actually be also around building relationships with banks, building those credit lines with banks, or if the way that DFI funding that is flowing oftentimes quite healthily into many of these countries that we're speaking about, if their focus should be actually creating these guarantees or some sort of other types of instrument that allows for MSCs in general to be able to actually get to these different sources of financing better. So that's just one thing. And then in the follow-up of the report that we're doing, one of the suggestions we had was for markets like Kenya, where there seems to be almost there's just a lot of different programs. And when a lot of programs happen, that exact gender bias people talked about in this podcast shows up, which is that if you've gone through a woman-only accelerator, it almost is a negative for many of these founders, right? Which again, I think it actually speaks more about the general bias of the market than the program in itself. So if we were to look at it from that angle, it's almost like discouraging gender bias from the beginning, right? I think these intentions of having women-only groups are really fantastic for especially very burgeoning markets, like very, very early stage markets where there just needs to be some development of convening and pipeline generation for specifically women. Once your market is a little bit more developed, I think it's actually quite important to integrate many of these gender-focused programs to or co-ed programs so that you actually try to eliminate some of these gender biases for people who are looking at what their track record was so far. And I think this also helps actually exchange of ideas of why and how men pitch compared to women pitching. If you're working in the same type of product, you should be learning from each other in terms of how you pitch and things like that. The other area that we wanted to say in our reports was this concept of specialization. Being able to actually gather the data and enough experts around those specialized sectors works. Well, many of our hypotheses, at least, is that it works very much in favor for both founders as well as investors. Because what Eugenia was talking about, and please let me know how you approach that 20% you said, where you put aside for sectors you don't know well. I'm guessing some of the people you'll be speaking with are people who are experts in that sector, or companies that have gone through very sector-specific accelerators and incubators who have those experts on hand to be able to translate some of their technologies to investor-friendly terms. I think for many of the women founders, these translation work does need to happen within more specialized type of services. So it was a lot of different response to many of the different points that are being said. But I think what to do is not actually, to me, about what should women be doing so differently. I think it's actually about the access to things are designed less friendly to women.
I think we've kind of covered the main things, and I honestly think some great actions have been taken here. But now thinking about the people that would be listening to this, which would primarily be female founders and most likely be from emerging markets, there are some kind of success stories when it comes to female founders that have, been successful, whether you look at Eventbrite or whether you look at Canva or whatever. But I was going to relay back again to you guys of when you think of like role models in this space or like women who have done it well and should probably be like someone to look to or investors to look to, does any specific story or any specific person come to mind?
I would say, like, if I gave one advice to female founders in terms of, who to follow, who to look at, I'd say Victoria Repa is a good one. She built the app called Better Me. She is a Ukrainian founder. She fled from Kiev when the war started, but she's been building in public. She's been super active on social media. She's been promoting kind of healthy lifestyle and also conscious lifestyle, which for many founders is also an issue. So many people are overworking and working 24/7. So if I would name one, that's probably be her. But in general, I would say this is so important to build your support network. As a first-time founder, then as a second-time founder, that's probably nothing more important than this. From the VC perspective, even, the introductions from the founders of the current portfolio of the VC is a top one source of quality deal flow for VCs. So when you as a founder network with fellow founders, make sure that you ask for the intros.
I have a pool I tap into normally because of my own podcast, and I could name every single person who ever came to the podcast, and I'm like, you are amazing. You're building something incredible. But in terms of like the investors, There were two I know of. They are in the femtech space. One is called Daya. It's a venture capital firm. They're Scandinavia based. Another one I got a chance to talk to. Her name is Afia Basoa. She's from Capital Group. She's a neuroscientist that became a VC, a venture builder, and she invests across Europe and the US, but specifically in Ghana. I would say she's one of the inspiring women I had a chance to meet recently.
Just on my end, because I've been working more from the data angle of things, I think the cases of making a success case, sometimes there's a gender bias in some ways in that, meaning oftentimes when we look for success cases as a company when doing many of these reports are oftentimes, it's about who raises the most. It's about who shows up the most on the radar in terms of, hey, so-and-so just raised Series D. And I know that is an indication of how much they're scaling, how much they're doing, but it's in many ways quite counterintuitive to what we were just saying earlier, right? Which is, who are these companies that are actually reached revenue-driven business model quickest? Who are the companies who have managed to have revenue to profit model business, even if it's at a smaller scale, that has worked for many years, right? I think there are also these different kind of quote unquote success stories that need to be told. But I think I'm just inspired to take this conversation forward and start actually measuring some of these other data points, which are, how many years or months does it take to go from founding to generating your first profit? How well do these profits last? Maybe suggestion is I will be reaching out to many of you guys and many of the founders. And if you're listening to this and I'm reaching out, please be open to sharing some of your experiences and some of your sheets. I promise I'll make it anonymous. But I do think that more than qualitative stories, I think some of these quantitative stories are to be played a little bit more in the future as well.
To be honest with you, every time I am in a room like this particular one, honestly, it gives me a lot of hope, and it gives me a lot of there is no doom in what we're discussing, okay? As long as we have each other, and as long as we're able to build these lasting connections and listen to each other and actually help each other. Even being here today, I've learned a lot, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to spread this knowledge further. I'm going to talk to more women. I'm going to, I'm going to do my thing only because this happened today. But this is a result of many women who talked to me, okay? And many women who inspired me and who did incredible things I took on and took in.
Thank you for listening to Women in the Building. If you want to share any thoughts on what we've discussed or ideas for other conversations, please feel free to write them in the review section in whatever podcast app you use. I'm Bella, your host, and this podcast was produced by Libo Studio. See you in the next one.